Shlomo Fischer, who is a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute and a retired professor at the Shlomo Fox School of Education and Hebrew University. His remarks will focus on public education as social reform. Shlomo? We need to unmute Shlomo.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, not exactly, but I'll be talking about the book in general. Okay, this presentation is to a certain extent a continuation of a conversation that Philip Wexler had with me in 2008 at a conference on Jewish spirituality in Beersheba. We were on the way to lunch. He explained to me that he had this project of rethinking sociological concepts and basically of replacing basic sociological concepts that come out of the Christian and Protestant traditions, such as charisma, with concepts that come out of the Jewish tradition. And I thought that was an interesting idea. And then I sort of, and I did write a couple of reviews of Philip's books for Sociologia Israelite, which is the local periodical on sociology and stuff like that. And here 12 years later, so we have a book that sort of lays the groundwork for a conversation between Rabbi Schneerson and classical and critical social theory. And of course, at the heart of this conversation, as the book very clearly states, is the issue of disenchantment and Weber's famous concept of the disenchantment of the world. And in this book, of course, the book asks, what does Schneerson want? And accordingly, the book answers that he wants the re-enchantment of the world. So, okay, so I'd like to take a very brief look, closer look at this concept of re-enchantment. And I'd like to do so analytically. I would like to do so using Habermas's concepts, which he got from Parsons, but the Habermas's concepts of life, world, and system, and to sort of parse out what is meant by re-enchantment. And life world refers to those realms of life which are ordered by what Habermas calls communication and understanding, that is, agreement through rational argument. It encompasses the realms of values, community, education, and provides trust and meaning. System, as opposed to that, refers to those realms, to those aspects of social life in which behavior is either induced or coerced. The major media are money and power, and in central realms are the state and the market. And so according to Habermas, the disenchantment that Weber famously speaks about, and the iron cage, which of course also stars in the book, is in fact the colonization of the life world by system, that the state and the corporation, with their bureaucratic and legal rules, and the market and its incentives, not only dominate the world of work and vocation, making them totally alienated, but also the realms of education and even community and family. That's the colonization that Habermas talks about. So if viewed in those terms, so then you can say that what Schneerson, what the Rebbe advocated, is the counter-invasion of system by life world. In other words, that we should consciously create education for meaning and ethics, and not only for profession, to put prayer or a moment of silence in the schools, to replace prisons. Jody was at the point of talking about this, but to replace prisons, the naked power of enforcement with rehabilitative education in the community. So the latter especially is colonization of system by life world. So that's a way that I would suggest to parse out Schneerson's re-enchantment, that it consists of the reverse colonization of life world, of system by life world. Okay, so if we accept, this is a very thumbnail analysis, but this could be a good heuristic device for trying to take the paradigm that the Rebbe advances and trying to address other social issues over here. And one issue that I'd like to very, very briefly address is the issue of the deaths of despair. And I'm referring here, to, of course, to the work of Angus Deaton and Anne Case, where you have not the colonization of the life world by system, but what you really have is the destruction of the life world by system. And in other words, that what the deaths of despair, in fact, describe is that the autonomous neoliberal functional logic of the market and globalization have totally destroyed personality, culture, and society of the traditional working class, traditional industrial working class, leading to total loss of meaning and freedom and ridiculously high rates of death by alcoholism, suicide, and drug abuse. So, what would the Rebbe have to say about this, right? A life of being constantly stoned on opioids or alcohol and playing video games is clearly not a life that can be considered a life devoted to one's task in the world, in the same way that incarceration can't be considered a life devoted to one's task in the world. So I'm trying to imagine what sort of policy response a sociology informed by Chabad and Torat Menachem would generate. So I want to be a little bit radical, and I would probably say, I don't have an answer to this, but if it would pop into my mind that maybe a suggestion of basic income would be a policy response that would be consistent with Schneerson's social vision, in which we separate income, making a living, from work, and that engaging in work is for its own sake, and thus what verticality contributes to this conversation is that the concepts of life world, of values and community and education, that they're treated as ends in themselves, as of things in themselves, and not either as superstructure, byproducts, or systemic requirements for society's functioning. If this project, if Philip and Ellie's project and Michael's project is serious, then it has to generate research and fruitful analysis of contemporary issues, including policy recommendations. But at the same time, if it's serious, it has to be adequate to the ground upon which it grows. And I think over here that the book, which I did enjoy, but I think the book here falls a little short, and that it does not include two topics which I think should be central to any discussion of the Rebbe's social vision. And I think as a result of this omission, perhaps the argument loses credibility. The first topic that should be in the book, to my mind, and is not, is the racial tension and race relations in Crown Heights, right? And Schneerson himself was directly involved in this. And this is a nitty-gritty issue, but I think you can't discuss the Rebbe's social vision without relating to this topic. It's not as if mere administrators were involved. Schneerson was directly involved in this. He was the one who, I remember in 1965, called on the Jewish population of Crown Heights not to leave the neighborhood. That was not understood, that call of not to leave the neighborhood was not understood as conciliatory. I lived in Crown Heights. It was understood as Jews standing up for their own against a different ethnic group. And then, and similarly, Chabad, Lubavitcher was the first group that organized Jewish self-defense against crime, read black crime, in Crown Heights. So this is an issue which I think you have to deal with somehow if you want to talk about social vision in any concrete fashion. The other topic, which I think should have been in the book and is not, is the entire discussion of emissaryship, of shlichut. And these are the Chabad houses and the 4,000 or so Chabad emissaries to every community in the United States and many in the world. And this is the social institution, which I think is the Rebbe's legacy. I think, it's very nice that Senator Keating put in a proclamation into Congress, but, emissaryship, the shlichim, the shluchim, as they say colloquially, have impacted thousands, if not millions, of Jews and other individuals. And this is the Rebbe's institutional legacy. and its absence is somewhat, to me, somewhat glaring. And I would say that the two things that these things have in common is Jewish particularism and Jewish particularity and ethnocentrism. And the book sort of blithely says that the Rebbe's vision was universal, yet I think that that's somewhat, if not completely overdrawn, that portrayal. First of all, completely ignores the blatant ethnocentrism and anti-Gentile attitudes that are part and parcel of Chabad's canonical message and text. And if practically speaking, I would say that the vast majority, I wrote here in my text 90%, so maybe it's a little less. I heard about the Noahide thing, of the Rebbe's and Chabad's energy, resources, and time was devoted to Jewish revival. And I was in Chabad Yeshiva, and I personally went on Mivtza Tefillin many, many times. I never went on a B'nai Noach Mivtza. I didn't know anybody who went on a B'nai Noach Mivtza. Nobody talked about it. So in terms of the lived life, we're talking about Jewish particularism. And now I would say that if you want to rethink sociology from a non-Christian perspective, then this issue of particularism, this tension, this dialectic of particularism and universalism, right? In other words, that just as they have a very nice analysis of individuals, of the dialectic of individualism and collectivism, you need a serious discussion of the dialectic, of the tension of universalism and particularism. And this is especially necessary if you want to rethink sociology, because, Parsons and the pattern variables, good and modern and progressive is universal, primitive and no good, etc., is particular. And that's been, I know that Parsons has been gutted, but that part of Parsons, the bias of sociology towards universalism, I think is still there. And I think that and the roots, let's be frank about this, the roots are in Galatians 3:28. There is neither Greek nor Jew like this. If you want to do this project and you want to do it thoroughly, then you have to seriously confront this issue. And I make these remarks simply because I think the issue is very important, and I think that these issues have to be brought up. And I'm very glad to be here. Thank you very much. I'm finished,
Thank you, Shlomo. Thank you. We appreciate those remarks. Jody, we're so happy to see you back with us after you were unceremoniously dumped by the technology gods. When last we heard from you, you were talking about the Book of Esther. We're hoping you can conclude your remarks this time without interruption.
Thank you. I warned you, my internet is not that secure sometimes. But I was talking about the people in the Book of Esther. That was the reason for the Rebbe giving his talk that he talked about incarceration, did not give the same privilege that he was talking about for Jews to the people who just thought and planned to kill the Jews. They were just summarily executed. And I'm going to say, I think what Shlomo just was talking about, but I want to put it back into the terms that Wexler does in the book. The verticality is not undifferentiated humanity in the middle. There's the B'nai Noach, and then there is the Jews. And it really was significant that the Rebbe made a change in the practical approach to non-Jews, that Jews, what he said, Jews have an obligation to teach B'nai Noach their duties toward God and the 7 commandments given to the sons of Noah. And crucially, Jews are obligated to cooperate with governments friendly to Jews in order to advance the Messianic redemption. So this change did not affect the Chabad position that Jewish souls are fundamentally different from and superior to non-Jewish souls, but it obscured the harshness of the theological stance. So, but I'm going to say that is why, because of that theological difference, Chabad during Schneerson's time and afterwards has not been involved in social reform movements that improve society when the beneficiaries will be mostly not Jewish. It also explains that Chabad gets involved in larger reform efforts, and you have to look at this, because the larger scope is necessary for improving the Jews' own lot. Schneerson moved Chabad to become more caring, but the job isn't finished. And now here I just want to end with a comment, because this has been going back and forth since all morning. I wonder whether theology matters when we assess the moral value of a good turn. I, as a Jew, benefit from the acts of loving kindness of local Chabadniks. I enjoy the hospitality offered at their homes and at the campus Chabad house. These generosities are granted to me despite my lack of fealty to Schneerson and to Orthodox Judaism. I hear Chabad parents repeat lessons from the Rebbe, emphasizing the need to act graciously towards non-Jews. In particular, if they ask for charity, you must give something. In my neighborhood, Chabad has drug rehabilitation programs that warmly include non-Jews as clients, even in the expensive residential treatment programs that are provided to them free of charge. In other words, Chabad raises money to help those people and Jews also. If in the innermost thoughts of Chabadniks, I am a Jew invited to dinner because I am sorely in need of mitzvot, does that matter? If in their theology, the non-Jewish addict they are helping cure is merely B'nai Noach who bears a lesser soul, does that matter? On the level of practical life, which is nothing to be, scorned, I don't think so. The world is surely a better place. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody. I'm pleased that we were able to hear your conclusory remarks. At this point, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Bruce Gitlin, who is the Executive Director of the New York Center for Law and Justice, a legal services organization dedicated to advancing the rights of the deaf and hard of hearing communities. Bruce?
Thank you, Steve. And I want to take this opportunity before I begin to thank the organizers of the seminar for the invitation to speak, and to thank Philip and Eli and Michael for this book that moved me and challenged me to think in a lot of deep ways. And I wanted to take a moment to explain that the short remarks that I prepared were an effort to join the teachings of the book and my experience over the past 20 years running a not-for-profit in behalf of the indigent deaf community, which I do with my wife, Liz Gitlin, who's my partner. So what I have to say is a reflection on what I read as it can be applied to the modern world.
Sorry for interrupting. There seems to be a little bit of noise. Maybe your papers are on the microphone.
Okay, thank you. They were near it, certainly. A review of the American Bar Association's Model Rules of Professional Conduct reveals a series of standards imposed upon lawyers in the representation of a client. Among the standards promulgated are rules concerning confidentiality, diligence, fees, conflicts of interest, scope of representation, and allocation of authority between client and lawyer. In its preamble, lawyers are reminded of the following aspiration. As a public citizen, a lawyer should seek improvement of the law, access to the legal system, the administration of justice, and the quality of service rendered by the legal profession. The American Bar Association's model rules and the individual rules of professional conduct that are promulgated by the states aim to provide the delivery of competent and fair and just and rigorous representation. Notably, however, and assuredly not surprisingly, the concept of love is not captured in the model rules, nor the many state rules on professional conduct. What might a model rule reflect if the notion of an attorney's love for a client were recognized? Furthermore, what might a model rule reveal if the notion of love between lawyer and client, between two human beings, was understood as opening the door to entering into a loving relationship with God? Such a thought experiment might yield this formulation of a proposed model rule. In all professional functions, a lawyer should seek to cultivate a bond with the lawyer's client that is based upon, among other foundations, love. In developing such a relationship, the lawyer will find a pathway to sustaining a loving relationship with God. The comment below the model rule might read something like this. In seeking to cultivate a bond between lawyer and client that is based upon love, the goal is to see the absolute dignity and humanity in each individual who the lawyer serves. The act of love should inspire the lawyer to fully commit, in the words of Jewish morning prayers. Again, we could talk about the tension between the universal and particular. I'm writing this as someone who is engaged in my Jewish faith tradition. The act of love should inspire the lawyer to fully commit to the release of those who are bound, to raise those who are downtrodden, to support those who are falling, to free those who are fettered, and to keep faith with those who sleep in dust. It appears nearly axiomatic that the legal profession will not encounter the day when model rules of professional conduct will be based upon, among other things, love. I would suggest, however, in the daily life of the lawyer, such a model rule would intensify the calculus applied to the nature of the lawyer's representation of a client, particularly a legal services client. For example, the consistent application of holistic services, that is both a social and legal service component offered to a client after identifying not only the legal issue that the client seeks representation for, but also the myriad of other issues pressing upon a client, would become the norm, perhaps, if love was entered into the calculation, as lawyers would apprehend and learn to understand what is needed to achieve the restoration of full dignity to the diminished legal services client, to those clients who sleep in COVID-infested shelters. We have many of those clients we represent now, who are unable to obtain sufficient food for an ample daily meal, who have limited prospects of finding employment, who are ill due to compromised health care, who live in fear of deportation, even as they seek asylum on our shores, who have paltry funds for weekly living, whose children strive to do homework in shelters or degraded private dwellings, and whose spirit is crushed under the burden of so many other profound challenges. Imagine, moreover, what funding, both government and philanthropic, might look like for legal services as our elected officials and our generous benefactors turn their attention with deep empathy, insight, and caring to apprehending the implications of what it means to love citizens who are in need of legal and social services. As reported by the Legal Services Corporation in a Justice Gap report, in or about 2017, 86% of the civil legal problems reported by low-income Americans received inadequate or absolutely no legal help. I can only think that one of my clients, furthermore, who is deaf and who spent decades in prison, who would not have been tossed into solitary confinement for years, with the additional sensory deprivation of not having the capacity to hear the footsteps of guards who are walking up and down the hall, which would have assisted him with maintaining his mental balance and his sanity if the guards or the prison administration cultivated a sense of love for their charge. Or another client who is deaf, who was left behind in his prison cell on Sundays, who we represented, when his fellow prisoners attended church services within the prison, a balm that leads to mental and emotional and spiritual comfort and the work of redemption, because the prison authorities were unwilling to provide my client with an American Sign Language interpreter to interpret the words of his fellow prisoner's minister. I might envision, if love was a part of the equation, that so many of my homeless clients who are deaf would not live for years in homeless shelters, far more than the average duration of shelter stay for other homeless residents who are hearing, because the shelter staff would ensure that there were American Sign Language interpreters so that my clients could effectively communicate every week with their case managers, whose task it is to find housing and work for shelter residents. I can also perceive what the experience might be for many of my deaf clients who do not receive interpreters in the emergency room or when admitted to the hospital, because the administration of those institutions does not ensure that the availability of ASL interpreters is made. Those clients would be able, under such circumstances where love was a part of the calculation, to effectively communicate what is ailing them and to understand the cure. Is it not true today, as recounted by Philip and Eli and Michael, concerning an age-old Talmudic tale, that the world, stumbling upon a poor or disabled individual, perhaps one of the many nation's legal services clients, rather than seeing the divine in that individual, sees only otherliness? And as Philip and Eli and Michael teach, Rabbi Schneerson wanted to re-enchant, and Shlomo, you had talked so eloquently about this, and wanted to re-enchant the world. He wanted to re-enchant and re-sacralize the everyday experiences, practices, and interactions of all people everywhere. And my rhetoric, my polemic at this moment is to suggest that those teachings can be brought down into the everyday life of the legal profession and into the relationship between the lawyer and the client, that they don't have to be exquisite, eloquent, lofty principles, but rather there's an application that can create a turning, a change in the manner in which people take on pro bono work, commit themselves as full-time lawyers in the legal services profession, and donate and support other legal services enterprises, including in support of the prison population, as the book covers, or environmental causes and beyond. I think that lawyers and case managers who oversee social services, as well as their administrators, have much to learn from the notion of cultivating a sense of love for their clients, which raises up not only the dignity of the client, as we would imagine, but also of the lawyer and the case manager and administrator, as well as humanity. Finally, at this time of year, I might state that in embracing the notion of love in a legal setting, both the lawyer and the client in the greater community moves all the more closer to the petition spoken so eloquently in the words of the psalmist and recited in the daily Jewish liturgy at this time as we approach the days of holiness. The psalmist states, "One thing I ask of Adonai, of God, for this I yearn, to dwell in the house of Adonai all the days of my life, to behold Adonai's beauty, to pray in Adonai's sanctuary." As we have learned from Rabbi Schneerson through Philip's and Eli's and Michael's book, and as applied to lawyers, we might consider that the role of a lawyer who is oriented toward a spiritual view of our world can, through love, create a dwelling for God in the lower realms beginning immediately this season. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Your remarks have particular relevance to me as a former public defender in Philadelphia. I just want to make note for all of our attendees that our session may go to 4:20 or so. We hope you'll stay with us. Our final speaker is Dale Dannefer. Dale is the Sella Chamberlain Professor of Sociology and the Chair of the Department of Sociology at Case Western Reserve University, and his remarks will focus on comparing and contrasting the Hasidic and Protestant traditions. Dale?
Well, thank you, Steve, and I would also like to thank Philip for the invitation to participate. It's certainly an honor for me, especially because I'm an outlier, I think, in several respects. And perhaps most of all, because I approach the topic of spirituality and justice at some level as I approach all of my work as a believing Christian. And for me, a key question, therefore, concerns the intersections of social vision, the Philip and colleagues' book, with ideas, principles, and practices that are inherent to Christian faith and the Christian community, those of us who seek to follow Jesus. There are surely many points of potential intersection, and I myself am really not the best person to speak to such matters because this whole area is not at all my area of expertise. I think that's another way in which I'm an outlier. However, from my layperson's perspective, I will suggest one possible starting point for some dialogue over such principles organized around the key Christian concept of grace. Grace, which can be defined as unmerited favor. I'm sure that this concept, grace, is relevant to issues of social justice in many ways, but in particular in its implications for breaking through conventional ways of dealing with injustice. Within the Christian tradition, one historically recent manifestation of this that also happens to be relevant in the present time is the American Civil Rights Movement of half a century ago. This was a struggle from the beginning. I don't know why I'm getting a phone call now. It hasn't rung all day. Excuse me. This was a struggle from the beginning, grounded in the vertical as well as the horizontal, the spiritual as well as the social. Its leaders were exemplars not only of the quest for justice, but not only of the quest for justice, but also of great spiritual depth, and whose lives manifested what the Apostle Paul called fruits of the Spirit. And I thought I was going to be the only person mentioning Galatians, but I was scooped on that by Shlomo. But Paul said the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things, Paul wrote, there is no law. We are all at least somewhat familiar, I expect, with the march from Selma to Montgomery that is still central in the history of that movement. However, a key feature of that march and the struggle that it represents that's often gone unrecognized and unappreciated is precisely its roots, which were in the deep faith of its leaders and many followers, and which empowered them to proceed with courage and grace in a way that manifested all of the fruits of the Spirit. We heard a bit of this history recently at Congressman John Lewis's funeral, when his own steadfast witness of nonviolent resistance, which had both spiritual and structural dimensions, was highlighted. With a manifest love for their enemies who were armed, vicious, and cruel, the Selma protesters modeled a different way of living and changed the nation in so doing. They were models of grace, I think, and it was grace that called for courage as well as peace, gentleness, and self-control. In my experience, conversations with those who are from that time and place have made clear that a concern with the relation of spirituality and action and a vibrant faith were absolutely central to that effort, which of course produced Jewish as well as Christian martyrs. As I understand it, this work began from the premise that human beings are all the recipients of God's grace, and given that, we as humans are also in a position to show grace to others. In his latter years, John Lewis lamented the fact that this vertical dimension of the spiritual and faith-based foundation of the civil rights struggle was too often forgotten. Okay, I had a second example, but I'm going to skip that on the to save a little time. So it would be dangerous, of course, to confuse issues that involve justice per se with grace. Reparations, for example, are not about grace, but about redressing gross injustices. Perhaps a bit more subtly, the same can be said about giving alms or other kinds of so-called beneficences, or even the Hebrew notion of the year of Jubilee, all of which are welcome but function mainly to correct and redress injustice that results from basic human tendencies for wealth and power to accumulate unfairly. Grace pushes us, I think, to think about the framing of a spirituality beyond the matters of redressing injustice, and to think about a struggle that calls for something more than a re-equilibration. And I'm not sure exactly where that leaves matters. I don't know what that something more is exactly. But thinking about a conversation going forward, I do want to note that in its current formulation, Social Vision addresses the matter of Christian faith and practice, mainly at the beginning in its uncritical acceptance of Max Weber's account of a narrowly defined and dismal Protestant ethic. Leaving aside the debate over Weber's thesis, the Protestant logic that he describes cannot be taken as a description of the faith of most Protestants, I think, then or now, and it certainly describes nothing to which most Christians that I know can relate. So one closing suggestion, at least in terms of Philip's arguments and Social Vision's argument, would be to contrast the Chabad movement, not with Weber, but perhaps with some progressive Christian initiatives, like, for example, the contemporary Sojourners movement in the United States, or the Catholic worker movement, or other such initiatives, similarly poised in prophetic opposition to the spiritually and socially barren thrust of the contemporary world, which is both secular and religiously barren, I think, and to which Social Vision intends to offer a response. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, Dale. At this time, what we'd like to do is to allow you good folks to interact with each other. I'm sure that your individual remarks have raised questions and comments in the minds of your colleagues. So let me go to Jeff. Jeff, is there a reaction, a question, a comment you have with respect to anything your other panel have discussed today?
Well, I'm struck by how the speakers all stayed within a religious tradition. And I just don't see how that's a way forward. I see how that is a looking back, but to me, it's just more of the chess game. You know, it's more looking at their traditions for resources to relate to one another, which is a perfectly good thing, but it seems to me it's inadequate. And so that's what I hear. Whether you're talking about Protestantism or Orthodox Judaism or really anything, it's still a religious identity. And I'm also struck by how, frankly, old we all are. And, you know, what the younger generation would say, you know, what the 20-somethings would say to this. So I'm suspicious, you know, frankly. I'm the academic who's the critic here, to use Shell's earlier term. I'm not saying something positive, I'm saying something depressing. I guess I'm a bit depressed.
Well, Jeff, I'm 34 years old. I've just had it's just been a hard life.
Yeah.
So I won't take offense at that. But Jody, I think Jeff's comment is of particular interest to probably you, and as well as you, Shlomo. Jody, let me first ask you, any reaction?
You know what? I think old people have a lot to offer. And I think young students sometimes accept that.
Yeah.
I did hear, I think earlier today, someone talking about how great Chabad is on campus and so on and so forth, and how young people get involved in it. And in my campus, all that liquor, all that warmth, all those cookies, it's like, it's really a Hamish, like a very welcoming place. They do not pay any attention to the adjurations to do more mitzvot or anything else. And they certainly do not get a social justice message. The kids that are activated by social justice generally aren't looking at religion, but we are, because we're looking at this book. I also feel like, Jeffrey, you know, I feel like I'm being an academic when I say I'm not sure how much theology matters. I think I'm being truthful in saying, you know, the theology has something I don't really like in it, but he's making people behave better, you know, and not as well as I think he should, and not as much as the authors are giving him credit for.
Yeah.
But would this drug rehab effort be there? Would the prison reform effort be there if not for the Rebbe? I'm not sure it would. And I feel that's being truthful. It is, you do not see those types of efforts in other parts of the Orthodox world. You know, the fact of the matter is people are organized in religion, so why not address that?
The students I work with at Rice, and certainly the people I work with at Esalen or in other SBNR contexts, have just given up on religion. They've just left, you know, and I don't, so I'm looking for an answer to that, I guess. My questions may be different than what the questions of this group are. I'm very sensitive. I mean, I don't think young people have the answer either, Jody. And I think people of older generations do have answers, who have a kind of wisdom. So I honor that. But I'm just commenting on how our answers are not really addressing the people I talk to, the young people I talk to, who have no religious tradition. You know, they have no Torah, they have no New Testament, they have nothing. And I don't see how any of this is an answer to that. Just preserving or reaffirming a traditional religious identity.
I'd be interested in hearing, Bruce, what you have to say about that, because it seems to me that your remarks are not necessarily bereft of religion, but what you derive from it, love, does have a universalism to it. What's your reaction to that? You have to unmute yourself, Bruce.
Thank you. So first I thought that the notion of love, and I suppose you can separate love from a religious context, but I thought in this context, the notion of love has the ability to transcend different particular religious faiths. And it creates, in my mind, a sort of common denominator, which a person of any faith could identify with and embrace and use as an organizing principle to advance social action and social justice. That's my first observation. And that's what I thought made sense to me in reading the book, because I've been listening over the past 2 days to this tension between universal and particular. And it seems to me, whether you render the work of Rabbi Schneerson as particular or universal or somewhere in between, the notion of love bridges everything. And then I was just, Jeffrey, when you were speaking just before, I was thinking that maybe it's possible to take the religious behavioralism out of the conversation and just potentially focus on the notion of theology, if that's possible. The notion of God, what God represents, whether we're talking about a transcendent God or an immanent God, but the notion that there is some ideal, and forgive me for using just subjective words that are coming to my mind. This is not a scholarly recitation at all, but an ideal that might challenge us to go beyond ourselves, whatever our formulation of that ideal is, whether it's a traditional sense, theological sense of God or not. And so to that extent, for me anyway, the religion is one important ingredient to motivate me, to inspire me, to push harder. Not necessarily, for me, the religious behavioralism, the liturgy, studying Torah, certainly helps to corroborate and add to my, my thoughts and actions. But at the very core, to think of an ideal, and also the ideal being based on the central foundation of love, causes me to conclude that some religious theological component is important to really make, maybe not for everyone, for me at least, an absolute commitment to something that I believe in that's dear.
Can I speak to that, Steve? I mean, I think that's a crucial point. Bruce, I love what you do. I mean, and I say that, you know, in all seriousness. My issue is, you know, most religious communities I know of speak about love and really believe in love, but they treat each other really poorly. You know, and there's a tremendous amount of violence between different religious traditions. The love ends at the religious identity. They love each other. They don't love the religious other. And so I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, can we imagine a love that is not bound by a particular religious identity? You know, I'm totally with you. And, you know, I go back to Nebraska to see my family. I mean, they're all Roman Catholics. The religion is their lingua franca. That's how they think. That's who they are. I honor that. I can't deny that, but it doesn't answer any of the questions I have when I come back to Houston and work with students at Rice University, who are all different, and who, very few of whom are German Roman Catholics. So I'm just pleading for, you know, help here. How do we build a future world that doesn't depend on local religious identities? And how do we love one another in a way that doesn't depend on a particular local theology? That to me is the burning question. And that's what I said when I began. I support the project. I differ with the solution.
If I might just add one quick sentence. And again, I'm not a scholar, but in my reflections on this subject, I was moved when I was first introduced to Fowler's 5 stages of faith, and understanding that as you go from the particularistic further and further up, if you can use that metaphor, Fowler may, you ultimately get to the source or the branch. And in my mind, that is a way to reconcile all the particularism with a sense of universalism or one source. I think Steve, you're muted. I
think you're muted, Steve.
My apologies. Shlomo, I wanted to get your last thoughts. We'll need to wrap this up in just a few more minutes. So if you can share with us some final thoughts.
Yeah, just like I don't have a direct answer to Jeffrey. I just have an experience which maybe it will sound nasty. I don't mean it in a nasty way, but you know, I was at Esalen, and I was the guest of Dolce and the guys who own it. I mean, and they were very gracious, and the cause was certainly worthwhile, my visit there. But my overall impression was that it's basically a business. My overall impression was that it was basically, you know, it was a good business. I mean, you know, it helped people, maybe people, you know, it was therapeutic for people and stuff like that. And you know, all this immanence, you know, didn't give you a place to stand where you could do anything, where you could critique society, where you could. So, I mean, I live in Israel. I mean, you know, I know what religious conflict is. I mean, like, you know, you know, I've been in the Israeli army for 20 years. I mean, like, I know what this is. I mean, you know, I did reserve duty. So I know what this is. And nevertheless, you know, I still feel that you need something you need a certain element of transcendence transcendence. It gives you, I've been talking to people, to even the study we just did, I just wrote in Hebrew with a friend of mine, with a close colleague of mine, about NCOs, non-commissioned officers in the Israeli army. And they were saying that religion gives me a place to stand where I could resist consumerism, crassness, this endless cycle of shopping and work and shopping and work, and this endless materialism. And if I didn't have this, I would just be lost. So you need a certain...
Shlomo, I must
Sure.
I must tell you how much I appreciate your words as our resident contrarian on the panel. So thanks very much for those remarks. And Dale, any final thoughts from you? You're
Probably good that I'm muted because I don't have anything to say that would be brief.
Well, perhaps just goodbye will suffice.
I talked to, I'm not sure how good a criterion it is to think about where young people's heads are at, but I also talk to a lot of college students and I find them all over the map, including international students, and I find them all over the map with these issues. Probably the mode is what Jeff describes, but there's a diversity of, I would say, searchers and practicers of many active practitioners of many faiths that I come across. I guess the one thing, not to be, I will say quickly that some people in my church last fall on a pilgrimage to Alabama, to Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham that really educated me about something I already thought I knew about, and I realized how little I knew about the experiences down there in the past, and I certainly recommend that experience to anyone. But I'm mentioning this partly because it seems to me that we right now may be at a kind of inflection point in the beginning of a new era of civil rights struggle, specifically race struggle here. And given and I think spirituality of the leadership was really important last time around. And I'm just curious how, I'm not sure that that's the same, that is the consciousness of people who may emerge as leaders now. I think so. It poses an interesting question for me, at least. So,
Thanks so much, Dale. We appreciate those sentiments. At this point, I want to thank Jeff, Jody, Shlomo, Bruce, and Dale for their participation. Thank all of our panelists for their gracing remarks and the exchanges, which leave us all with a great deal to contemplate about the enormous impact of the Rebbe's teachings in so many areas of the academy and in religious practice and in the secular world. So thank you all, and thank you to all of our attendees. I hope that you all have enjoyed this exercise as much as I have. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.